Yeah, so estate planning is a really broad concept in that estate planning can mean trying to, for a large family, trying to plan out and, plan how estate distributions will happen over the course of the next several generations. It could be a really large estate, trying to decipher among a number of different, descendants, but it could be as simple as, one person trying to leave their car or their home or their, personal property to a family member or loved one. So estate planning can be a lot of different things. It can be, like I said, something really significant and really large. And I think sometimes we think of it that way, but it can boil down to just simple things. So your personal property and making sure that that ends up in the hands of the people that you want it to end up in. So in terms of the second question about why it's important for Canadians to consider it sooner than later, um, the main sort of premise behind that or the reason behind that is estate planning is very much something that should be updated regularly. So I think sometimes people look at estate planning and they go, I will plan my estate when I have an estate to give to people. Uh, but that's again, like I said earlier, that's not necessarily true. Everyone has an estate. Everyone's got property that they have and they hold that they probably want to administer in different ways. But more importantly, uh, when you manage your estate or you start the process of preparing a will, for example, it's not just a one and done process and then you never look at it ever again. It's something that you can do early so that you set up this process, you have familiarity with the concepts, and then in the future it becomes a lot easier for you to update that when you really need to do it. So that's why there's a lot of benefits to doing it sooner and not waiting until the very last minute. I think the big one is that a lot of people think they don't need to do any estate planning until they're old, is what I often hear. But the reality is that, like I said, you have property and you have assets from a very early a period of time in your life. And so estate planning is more than just giving assets to like really high value assets to descendants or to other family members or different people. Um, it's also giving your prized possessions. So, if, at your untimely death or passing, you want to make sure that those possessions that you hold very dearly go to the people that you want them to go to. Yeah, so I think like I'll take this in a bit more of a broader sense. There's a number of legislative requirements, and there's a lot of specific components to a will or personal directive that you need to have. So, for example, you might want to think about, okay, what's going to happen with a business? What's going to happen with your shares that you own in a business? What's going to happen to the benefits or like pension benefits that you have, and how will that get paid out? Um, when it comes to health decisions and a personal directive, how are those decisions going to happen? Who's going to be making those decisions? So there's a lot of different considerations. I think the way that I'll answer that question is a bit broader, which is that um, in when you're looking at a well-prepared estate plan, I think it's something that has been thought over and considered in detail. So it's not something that you will, like I said, draft once and then never look at again. It might be something that takes a bit of time, takes a bit of reflection for you to think about all the implications of everything. So do you want to leave all of your assets to one individual? Do you want to leave all of your assets to maybe two or three different individuals? sometimes making that decision can seem really difficult when you actually start putting pen to paper. And so I think the most important thing from a big picture perspective is to ensure that it's very well thought out and it's not rushed and it's not something that you're making rash decisions in the moment, but that you're thinking it through and spending the time to consider all the various factors at play. So I think the biggest thing that I'll point to is the probate tax, which some provinces have no probate tax, and some provinces have a percentage tax, and some have just a flat fee, just depending on whatever. Sometimes there's a baseline of the value of the assets. So that's really important because in certain provinces where there is a percentage tax, it's a percentage of the assets that you hold. And so sometimes what happens is, if you hold property in Ontario or Quebec, for example, where there is a probate tax as a percentage, you may some individuals will want to transfer those prior to their death so that the probate tax actually doesn't apply. Whereas in jurisdictions like Alberta, where there is no percentage tax, there's not a huge difference in terms of whether in a lot of ways, it's actually better from a tax perspective as well to um, to do it at the time of to make that transfer at the time of your death. So I think the biggest thing is looking at the probate taxes and understanding where those properties are where that tax would actually hit. And then the other component to it is just from a big picture perspective, considering the tax implications for your beneficiaries, right? So there's capital gains, there's that you're going to be, facing. There's the base, cost base of the capital gain that the beneficiary is going to receive that asset at. So there's a lot of different tax considerations. And so I think when you're looking at it, if you hold property across Canada, I would recommend actually talking to either a tax lawyer as well or an accountant who understands estate planning to be able to facilitate uh, that component of it, because sometimes it's something that people don't really think about. The biggest one is not thinking about. So I think in families and there's a long time ago when I was in undergrad, I took a business course called Family Business. And one of the things that one of the main concepts from there was this idea of um, hierarchies, congruent hierarchies and incongruent hierarchies. So often in families, we have what's called congruent hierarchies, which is there's an idea that historically the oldest son, for example, would receive certain benefits. The oldest daughter would maybe receive different types of benefits than the oldest son, and then so on and so forth. Now, in today's modern world, there's a lot of different variations to that. The things don't always flow that same way, and so that can often lead to what's called incongruent hierarchies, where maybe, for example, in a business, if you're leading the shares of a business, if let's say the youngest daughter is the one that's most involved in the business, maybe the shares of the business are primarily left to the youngest daughter versus the oldest son, which may not have actually been the case in the past. And so I think that it's not that families make this mistake, but it's something that they don't always consider in advance, which is that can often cause a lot of tension amongst the beneficiaries. So having conversations about that early will prevent the beneficiaries from facing that conflict. Really good question, especially for Eternum, because of what you're building and what Eternum can offer to its own customers, there's a lot of estate planners who kind of overlook, or a lot of people who overlook the inherent value or the intrinsic value in those memories, those videos, those photos. And a lot of times that there's no process set up for that transfer. And so that's where, I think one of the benefits is for a company like, or to use it, work with a company like Eternum, is that that becomes more front of mind. So, when you have these photos, or you have these videos that people are taking, and taking of family and loved ones, um, instead of those just getting lost in the device of the deceased person, they can be transferred and passed down, which historically has not always happened. And so I think sometimes in the past, those types of digital assets have been overlooked, but hopefully now, and increasingly, estate planners and families are becoming more aware of that, and making it more of a priority to ensure that they have some sort of system to pass those down. It's a really good question. I think because it's something that we don't always talk about, and we're kind of the first, we're in the first generation of folks that are really having to deal with digital assets as part of their estate planning. So even social media accounts and access to social media accounts and things like that, those are all becoming more and more valuable. I was reading an article about when social media influencers, their accounts, and when those get passed down, and how that can work, and how the transfer can work, and whether it actually should be happening. Because often social media accounts are tied to someone's person, and so there's been issues where people have sort of uh, because they wanted to continue to carry on that business, they've sort of stepped in and started running an account for someone who has passed away, as if they're still alive. And so there's a lot of challenges with that. But I think the most important thing, with digital inheritance and some of these digital assets, is to think them through. And that sort of comes back to my original point of estate planning is not something that you want to rush. It's something that you want to take your time doing, so that you can have these considerations and think about, okay, what digital assets do I have that I would want to pass down? I think the most important thing is that estate planning is not just about the estate, but it's about the people related to the estate. So, of course, it's about the person who's passing away. It's that person's estate, or that couple's estate, or however, you want to look at that. But um, without having proper estate planning, you can also create a lot of conflict for your beneficiaries. So we have in Canada legislated requirements where if someone doesn't have a will, there is a line of succession of where assets will go. But sometimes people are unhappy with that, or people have been told something else, and that can create a lot of conflict. And when you're the person who is building your own will and doing your planning for your own estate, I would imagine that they don't want their beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries to encounter a lot of conflict because of this. And so thinking ahead is not just, and doing estate planning is not just for the wealthy. Number one, everyone has tons of their own assets, including digital assets, as we talked about. But also, this can help prevent a lot of family disputes in the future. Yeah, so I think it's sort of the same. Comes back to that whole concept of digital assets, and just thinking about the various assets that people don't really think about all the time. Um, Sometimes I've had I've had people talk to me about golf memberships, right? They have a golf membership somewhere where there's a long wait list to get in, and there's the ability to transfer that to someone else at your death. And like specifically for that golf club there was. And so that, is something that you wouldn't have thought of as something that would be an asset that would be passed down and something to think about. But I think when it comes to, family stories and traditions, and, not just wealth, I think they play a really big role in estate planning. And those are a lot of times the main things that people want to pass down. That's where I think, a service and a product like Eternum is great in that it brings these concepts front of mind. Yeah, I'm probably biased in it, but I think legal professionals should probably be engaged at a pretty early level. Um, estate planning, although the cost of preparing a will may seem like a lot at the time, uh, the worst thing that can happen and some of the most stressful situations for families is when there's disputes over a will. And so having a properly drafted will with all the right information and all the considerations can be really useful to prevent that. And then the other thing too is, there's like practically speaking, like I understand that there's, practical financial realities to people being able to hire lawyers uh, to prepare a will for them. I think most importantly, if you're going to be doing a will on your own or going to be doing your own will, it can be helpful to have even like an estate planner or a legal professional review the will. Maybe they don't draft it fully, but maybe they just give it a final review, because sometimes the most valuable insight that a legal professional can give is asking the right questions. So, there might be things that you may have missed on your own, but it can be helpful to have someone point those out. So, there's normally along with a will, sometimes there will be like a personal directive or power of attorney, so that if someone loses capacity when during some sort of health issue, then there's almost like a chain of command in some ways of who will be responsible and have the ability to make decisions on behalf of that person. So that's really a big one. Almost in a different avenue, more on the family business side of things, which is a bit of an interesting segue almost. Uh, a lot of times in family businesses, they will have shareholders agreements, and when you're a family business, all the shareholders might be family members. And so, what I've seen before and what I've seen becoming more common is for shareholders agreements to have very specific clauses about what happens when a shareholder dies. That exists in every shareholders agreement usually, and it should, but it especially should exist in a family business. And I think that's something that sometimes people don't really think about, but it's can be a really important consideration, especially if the business is going to continue to operate. I think it will change quite a bit. And what I would encourage people to do is to use platforms like Eternum, use platforms like this that help to bring these considerations front of mind and help uh, people think these important decisions through. Um, Not just from the perspective of, okay, I have these digital assets. I know that these are important things that I want to pass down appropriately, but also preserving these memories, right? I think sometimes we, especially in the digital age with technology, as you mentioned, we assume everything is backed up. We assume that, we've got everything saved on our laptop or on our phone. But when someone passes away, that doesn't always transfer over, right? Sometimes we lose those phones or we lose those laptops or we don't know the password and then we have to, go through that whole process. So having a system and that's where I think Eternum is great for that is having a system where there is a way to preserve these memories is huge. because the last thing you want to have when you're dealing with a loved one's death and trying to figure out how to, deal with the will and any probate is you don't want to have to go through the process of trying to track down photos and videos and memories. If there's a way for you to have that set up for yourself through a platform like Eternum or others, then I recommend being able to take that weight off your back. Early, plan early, and revisit your will and revisit your estate planning. So, if you develop a will right now, 10 years from now, your assets and your property and your digital assets might look very different. And it's important to revisit the will as well. So, coming back to it, having conversations with your family about it, and especially for those families where there are older family members, talking really openly about the will. I think, or not necessarily about the will, but about estate planning and being open and transparent about that, because the worst thing that can happen is that there's a number of disputes, and then the will gets sort of held, and the money doesn't, and the assets don't actually get distributed out, and a lot of money goes to legal fees and things like that. It's better if people are aware of things up front, and it makes it a lot easier for the beneficiaries too.